So, sort of an intro 101 to AI and AI art. I want to talk a little about what it means to be generative AI. Today, it's probably one of the biggest buzzwords I see within the AI space, which is this thing of Gen AI or generative AI. And if you look at this list of companies, like you'll see there's stuff ranging from audio to text to imagery to whatever 42 is, which I will not look up. There's just a lot of different companies doing different things, but they're all under the umbrella term of generative AI. And there's sort of two different definitions that I think are worth breaking down. And I think this also goes to some of the reasons why generative AI is both feels magical, but is also like a really big struggle for most people to wrap their heads around it or play with and to sort of experiment with and feel like they're not really getting the results they expected. So first off, let's talk about generative within the context of the AI world. So for this, I always like to break this down into two categories. First is what's called deep neural networks, and the other is what I have not found a real good definition for, but what I've heard people refer to as non-deep. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, deep neural networks were like all the rage. That was like the hot phrase. And it made it sound like really fancy, but it's actually really not. Easiest way to actually describe this is to look at the actual networks that we're creating in these things. And again, for most of us, we're not creating these networks, we're using them for other tooling or to train our models. But a deep network is what you see on the left. And you'll see that it has many, many, many layers. You could think about these as sort of maybe if-else statements or other sort of like programming sort of ideas. And what you'll see in this diagram here is on the left, you see this something called input layer. In the case of a text model, that might be words or phrases. In the case of a image model, that might be pixels. And it goes through this very complicated process that is called the deep neural network of these many, many layers, and then you get your output from it. Now, these circles you see here are often referred to as nodes or parameters. And actually, if you look at some models, you'll see people refer to the size of the model as the number of parameters in it. So it might be 100,000 parameters, or right now, like the rage is like 5 billion parameters. So there's lots and lots and lots of parameters within that. Whereas a non-deep network is an example of these very shallow sort of systems. You could, I would say, almost write your own if-else statements that could create a non-deep neural network. And some examples of that are like recommendation systems. So like what Netflix shows you, what it recommends to you as a video, what Spotify shows you as what songs you should be playing. And another example of this in the generative world where we're creating something might be something like a Markov chains. Markov chains, like maybe again a decade ago, were like all the rage for Twitter bots. You could feed in your content and it would like begin to spit out something that sounded like you. So even within both these categories, there are generative and non-generative machine or tooling. So we go back to this example. I'll sort of drop the non-deep and I'll talk a little about just deep networks in general. So in deep networks, there's then sort of two categories. One is called discriminators, or this might be referred to more commonly as classifiers. And I would say the sort of most famous example of this is if you saw the TV show Silicon Valley, in that they make an app that's called Hot Dog Not Hot Dog. And what does it do? It takes an image out and then it tells you whether the image is of a hot dog or not. These are classifiers. So these are not creating new content. They're really taking input content and applying a classification to that. So maybe saying it's a cat versus a dog, or in the case of text, maybe saying it is positive speech, meaning it's like happy and, going forward, and positive versus negative speech, which might be someone saying this thing sucks or whatever. So those are discriminators. But within the other class, and probably what we're mostly talking about here, is generators. And those sort of do the opposite of this. They actually create new content, right? And that's what the word generative means. And within this category, this is where we see a lot of the tools that are really hyped up today, right? So this is, ChatGPT. This is Stable Diffusion. This is a lot of new categories that are around sound creation and those sort of things. So in this case, we're talking about generative. We mean a thing that creates something. So rather than just purely classifying something, it creates new content or creates new imagery, new text. That's within sort of the space of AI. Now, where I think the term actually really came from is actually in the category of generative art. And I'll talk a little bit about generative art. I won't go too deep into it because it's a whole other topic. But I really sort of feel like generative art or procedural art was sort of where this term came from. In some cases, because a lot of the artists who were doing generative art moved over to generative AI. In other ways, just because it's a way to sort of describe this and give it some historical context. Generative art has been around for a long time. I mean, so is AI, but generative art, as more of a, like, maybe a little bit more awareness for people, has been around for almost 100 years now. And that could be artists like Vera Molnar, who did a lot with pen plotters. It could be artists like Casey Reese, who created the processing language, Joshua Davis, who did a lot with Flash and has now moved to more processing stuff as well. And maybe I'm kind of being a little biased here. I'm showing a certain look for generative art, which is a little bit more lines, a little bit more programmatic, shapes, moving shapes around the screen, that sort of thing. And that is definitely part of the work of generative art. So again, generative art is actually someone who writes code, writes a program, and then that draws things on screen, or maybe it creates sound, or again, maybe it is generating text. But again, it's always built around some code or some procedural process using maybe a UI like MaxMSP or a programming language like JavaScript or processing. Now, if we compare that to generative AI tends to be a little bit more photographic. Not always, but I tend to find it's a little bit more photographic. And at least as of a couple of years ago, it was also like a little bit more surreal. So you've got artists like Mario Klingemann or Helena Sarin. And what I think is actually really important about this distinction between these two is actually going to lead to why I think generative AI requires a certain new way of approaching tooling. So I want to talk a little bit about how each of these two categories of art would be made today. So first, in generative or procedural art, often you have a concept. I mean, always you should have a concept, but in these cases you would have a concept. You would then usually write code. Maybe you would go upload, you would find a library that someone had and build on top of that. Maybe you're using MaxMSP, which is a node-based editor, and there's less code writing, but still sort of plugging things in and doing if-else statements, that sort of thing. But there's always like a process to it, meaning you are writing code or you are creating some sort of process and structure for things to be made. And then out of that, you get your output. So in this case, we've got this thing that is very clearly like written. And if there are issues or bugs in the program, someone goes in and fixes them. Or if they don't like a certain output, they might change part of the code to change their output. Now, that's generative art, and that's where a lot of this came from, is artists who would write their own code or would use other people's programs to generate imagery. Now, in the generative AI landscape, it's actually a little bit different. In these cases, what is usually happening is you've got a concept, then you're pulling a data set, right? You're going out and scraping data from the internet. Maybe you're pulling down, books from Google Books, or you're pulling images off of Google Images. You then go through this process of training a model, which we won't get into here, but you basically make this model, and that model essentially contains all of your code. And it's not code that's readable like this kind of code. It's a very different type of code. And then from there, you get the output. And this is what maybe a couple years ago, this is what a generative AI artist would have done. They always would have trained their own models. But today, actually, most people sort of skip that step and they actually go and skip the data set and they just use someone else's model. This is, maybe like Stable Diffusion. You might use the Stable Diffusion model, or you would use DALL-E in their model. I think what's really important here to remember is that these models are these deep neural networks. And if you remember, like, we've got a billion parameters in here. And remember that a billion parameters, each one of those is like more or less an if-else statement, but also an if-else statement that is not human readable. So when you get an issue like, oh, my text to image doesn't look good, why is that? It might be because, what you fed in as text hit a different if-else statement than you expected it to. And this is the key to generative AI, and why I think so many people struggle with it today is there's no clear rule book for a lot of it. This black box you sort of see here is a nature of most of these generative models. And it requires a lot of trial and error to achieve the desired result. And you might look at someone else's art and say like, wow, they made this beautiful thing. And they might say like, oh yeah, I made it in a couple hours. But what they might not tell you is actually it took them a month to sort of figure out all the ins and outs of these models, or figure out how to get the right prompts included in the way that they want. So it's important to remember that generative AI has this sort of black box, which is, the problem is that most of the people even building these things don't necessarily know the full ins and outs of how these things work. And that therefore means it's put on us as artists or designers to actually figure out how they work. And that's usually where prompt engineering comes into play. I think this is also why these tools feel magical to us, because we don't understand how they work. Like, they're so complicated inside of that if-else statements that there's no way for us humanly to unpack 5 billion different features of those things. Now, there have been efforts by various researchers over the past decade to try to figure out what's actually happening in some of these models, but every time a new model comes out, it's almost got a different rule set inside of it. So as soon as you might think you figured out what this version of Midjourney is like, then a new version rolls out and it acts totally differently. And you can see on the internet, social media, like people freaking out when a model changes and they're like, I don't know how to use this thing now. And this is the biggest challenge that I see when artists and designers come into this space, is they expect it to be clear rules, like there's a way to figure this out, and I can just it's that programmatic world of like, if I tell you to put a square here, you should put a square here. But in the machine learning world, like that square might actually be a little bit over there, or it might be a circle, and like you have to kind of figure out what the machine is kind of learning, and you almost have to reverse engineer it. But this is why I think generative AI is so interesting, but also why it's so frustrating. And over the next couple of videos, I'll try to cover places where you might want to lean into this, or places where you might want to avoid it entirely. But I just want to quickly describe a little bit what generative AI is to people, because I think once you begin to break down those rules, it's a little bit easier to understand how they might work, or your approach to how to work with them. So I'll have a couple more videos coming up in the next couple weeks about how this works. But I hope this was helpful, and please ask me any questions you have around this content. Thanks.